It's the beginning of a new year, and I want to try an experiment, and I want you to join me. That's this week on the Badass Agile podcast. Greetings, team. Welcome to the Badass Agile podcast. I'm your host, Chris Williams. Greetings, team. Welcome back. Thank you so much, as always, for joining. So great to have you here. Welcome to all the new listeners. I appreciate and respect those of you who have been tuning in week after week for so long now, supporting the podcast, and just in general being part of the movement. So as a new year begins, I started asking, what can we explore, preferably together? And what exceptional value can I provide to you to make this podcast even better than last year? Well, first, let's remember why we're here. To create an elite tribe of leaders who truly serve their clients and communities by doing what matters and what works, relentlessly chasing value and excellence like a badass. There's so many resources about what you need to do to be agile, but we're focused on who you need to become in order to lead teams. So let's hammer down on those fundamentals to create a unique and powerful force in this industry. And if this helps you, tell your friends. Now this year, I want to deliver focused value based on things that you can't get anywhere else. I've always said it's not about doing, it's about being. And as Agile continues to spread beyond pure technology teams into everyday business and product delivery, it becomes ever more important to nail the root causes of Agile failure, so we can move on from implementation barriers and focus on perfecting the art and science of bringing value with less overhead and less stress. I want you to have real tools that aren't being offered anywhere else in the industry that'll help you, especially undertaking the elusive job of changing minds and delivering real success. Where I don't want to get into is moving back to the old way of defining success. Because before Agile really hit the scene in a big way, we were getting used to the idea of changing the expectation of what success meant. So if something was red, we would simply change some parameters until the exact same state registered green on a dashboard. I don't think that serves anybody. I think it's incumbent on us as practitioners and as leaders to ensure that what we're doing actually makes things better and makes companies and customers more effective. And in order to discover how we can do that, I'm going to experiment this year with intention. As my own professional practice develops, I'll be working specifically to notice and address specifically mindset issues. There will be others as the year progresses, but I'm going to start with this one. I want to test different approaches and hypotheses to overcoming fear and mindset issues. I'll study the different kinds of personalities in teams, the executive layer, customer layers, to see what kinds of techniques are effective on different people in different situations, and then play all this back to you. My hope is to be able to tell real stories of real success and real failure in busting cultures and changing minds, and to tease out what works and what doesn't in Agile and innovation everywhere. You don't have to poke around very long to figure out that the biggest problem with Agile success is not lack of knowledge or lack of tools. It's mindset, it's attitude, it's resistance, it's immovable cultures. And one of the things that I've noticed is that all of those problems have the same root: fear. So that's what this series is going to be about. Now, you know what's interesting is that there's a lot of empirical evidence that Agile, Scrum, and related technologies techniques actually do work. And yet, in the presence of actual proof that this can make you better, we still have difficulty making the right leap, making the whole leap, making the large commitment. This is the mindset change that we classically hear about. And you know what? It's not just a little bit of intimidation. It's not a case of the jitters. It's a deep fear of Agile and the change that it represents. It's a deep dependence on long-standing, monolithic cultures and attitudes. And you know what the worst thing about fear is? Is that nobody wants to call it by its name. Who wants to admit that they're afraid? Who wants to admit that fear drives their daily actions. And yet, it does for all of us. It's fear that keeps us from sticking our fingers in the unknown. It's fear that keeps us from doing wrong. It's fear that keeps us from taking risks. Fear has a very strong influence on our behaviors, oftentimes for better, but sometimes very much for the worst. And I've often stated and tend to agree highly with people who believe and theorize that those fears have a biological basis, and that many times that biological basis is no longer relevant for the century that we live in. It's fascinating to me how our bodies and minds are built to perceive challenges and threats, and then to elicit physiological responses to correctly handle those threats. But again, if those fears and threats are no longer relevant in our current century, then the automatic behaviors that they produce are also probably outdated, and that's why they no longer serve us. So to start off this series, I want to delve a little bit more into the different types of fear and how they manifest. Like everything else, let's do this with agility, guys. Let's start with a premise. Let's start with a general direction and a general vision. Let's suppose that there's probably about, let's say, 3 kinds of fear. The first one that's very pervasive that we've all experienced is fear of the unknown. In a business and corporate landscape, we'll call this one fear of change. This is really the big one because I always call it the need for certainty and safety. When we first come to an organization and we first start talking about implementing Agile, especially as it leaves the small, covert team rooms and becomes more of an enterprise standard that people have to align to, it represents change. People aren't sure if it will work. They're not comfortable rolling without a signed-off plan because that's the way we've always done things. And that signed-off plan provides assurance and safety. We're not comfortable without all the requirements signed off, guaranteed and certified and traceable. I think that this kind of fear is perhaps the most insidious of all the fears because it's the true antithesis of bravery and courage, which implies marching forward into the unknown precisely when the outcome is unclear. So until we learn to identify and attack that kind of fear, we're always going to struggle. Another kind of fear, which may be related but has a little bit of distinctness to it, is fear of failure. I think fear of failure is a relatively new and emerging area, and it's happening because in the past relatively short few decades, we see an increased adversity to the idea of failure itself. In fact, failure has become a dirty word. So if the first kind of fear keeps us and prevents us from adopting change, taking on new techniques, new mindsets, this kind of fear simply stops us from thinking outside the box at all. It prevents us from reaching and leaping and trying new things and experimenting. So in and of itself, the damage that we've done to our individual spirit and our individual expression because of the stigma associated with the F word, I think it's worth a deeper examination of how we treat failure and what we can do to unwind some of that damage. Another kind of fear is a fear of loss of esteem. So even if you're okay with failure, even if you're okay with jumping into the unknown, you just don't want to be the guy who goes first. Because nobody wants to look silly. Nobody wants to be the only one in the room who's wrong. Nobody wants to be the one who put their name or signature on something that ended up sinking the boat. Now, if you have those fears, you're never going to be free to be accountable. You're never going to want to be in the lead of anything. And I believe if you can't overcome this fear, you can never be the kind of leader who goes first. And if you can never be the kind of leader who goes first, you can't ever solve the first kind of fear, which is the fear of change and different and new things. Because if you can't find a leader who's willing to stick their necks out far enough, then nothing will ever change. We'll never do different things. Now, I know there's probably more kinds and classifications of fear, and we'll get to those, but I want to start with these 3. So in the coming weeks, we'll do a deeper examination of each type of fear, how it manifests, and then we'll focus on what are some of the techniques that you can use to get around them. And I'll base that discussion on real and practical experience in the field so I can let you know how it goes. We'll make little tweaks to it and see if we can improve it. Shortcut things, make them faster, more effective for a wider group of people. Now keep in mind, this is something that I have already a decent amount of experience doing. This is my favorite part of the job, is working with those fear-based mindsets and changing them. So I have some hypotheses about what might work. For example, for fear of the unknown, I've already mentioned that you need someone who is willing to go first and eliminate consequences for everyone who stands behind him or her. So we're going to need some technique on either finding those leaders or creating them. For fear of failure, maybe it's small, calculated experiments that help you inoculate against the fear by doing smaller things with smaller consequences and getting comfortable with those levels of risk until we can do more, much in the same way that we would overcome a fear of heights or a fear of public speaking by doing smaller, less risky versions of that experience first. When it comes to fear of loss of esteem, looking foolish, maybe it's social proof. Maybe it is having other people in the room to provide positive peer pressure and testimonials from others who are doing it, facing the fear, taking the challenge, and succeeding that will help more fearful, more inexperienced people overcome it. So we're going to try. We're going to do little experiments and observe the outcomes, and I'll report back with the specific steps, the specific language, the specific visuals, the specific imagery, the conversations, the objectives, and the outcomes that you can then take back into the field and use in your everyday. I also have a theory about what probably won't work. Logic. See, fear is never based on reason. In fact, if you've spent any time around human motivation, you'll know that nobody does anything, especially anything of consequence, for logical reasons. Most decisions are emotional ones. And this is why I think we have an opportunity this year to make so much impact. Because what's being taught in traditional Agile training and traditional Agile language, as it becomes more prevalent and spreads not just through organizations, but through our industry at large, is that we're focused on the tricks and the arguments that will convince people that Agile's the right thing to do. But if logic never works to overcome an emotional response, guess what? I think that's one of the reasons why we still struggle with changing minds, even in the face of overwhelming and increasing evidence. Agile can make us better. You know what else never works? The traditional management style of pushing things on people, forcing them. Because guess what? You can't use fear to undo the effects of fear. You're going to burn people out. I think one of the most beautiful objectives of agility was happier teams. So I always say, use pull, not push. Start an interesting fire that other people look at and want to come to get warm. Create pockets of success that other people will envy, which is an emotion, and naturally will be magnetized to it and want to come to it so they can have some of that for themselves and their teams. These are the things that I want to actually try and test and report back and give you some specifics on how to implement it in your daily Agile life. And I feel like this is becoming huge because I think we really are moving away from a place where Agile is just for developers and just for product. Increasingly, business and the world at large is moving faster. We're under increased pressure to deliver more value sooner. And hey, if we have simple tools that make it easy for us to do that in a way that doesn't stress us out or create undue pressure, why shouldn't we leverage them? Why shouldn't we take these things for competitive advantage? Better still, what I'm really interested in is if we can deliver more value in a shorter period of time, do we finally have an opportunity to free up more of our lives for the things that really matter to us by spending less time doing things that don't add any value? These are the concerns and questions that get me fired up for the coming year. And there's plenty more to come. I hope you find this valuable, and I definitely want to hear your questions or comments or your ideas on how I can make this more effective and more valuable for you. If you want some inspiration to help stay sharp and reinforce the badass Agile mindsets and practices, then stop in every weekday and grab the latest iteration of my new book. Go to badassagile.com and subscribe to get the coming week's pages right in your inbox, or check it out at medium.com. Just search for the working title, Field Notes for the Agile Leader. Folks, thank you for listening. You can reach out at badassagile.com or find me on Twitter at badass_agile. And I'll see you next time.